Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the second Wednesdays at noon session of the 2022-2023 academic year. Today, I'm pleased to introduce Drexel University Archives Technician Simon Ragovin for the session, A Partial History of the Enrollment of Black Students at Drexel. Before we get started, I want to run through a few housekeeping items. First, we are recording this session, and I will send a link to the video later this week so you can revisit the webinar at your convenience. We also ask that you stay muted throughout the session. You can answer or you can enter questions in chat and save them until the end. As you all settle in, I wanted to mention a few upcoming events that we also have planned. We have 4 more Wednesdays at noon events scheduled for the fall term, including next week's October 19th session, which will explore using archival collections to teach and engage students. Open Access Week is also coming up in a few weeks, and we're excited to host several in-person and virtual events that focus on the importance of providing free, open access to information and research throughout that week. Then on December 5th, we kick off our annual Scholarship event series. This year, each of the 3 scholarship events will explore the theme of climate change and sustainability. I'll drop a link to our events calendar in the chat so you can read more about all these exciting events. We hope to see you there. And now, if we're all set, I'll turn it over to Simon.
All right, thanks, Rachel. So just to kind of start, just to make it clear that as an archivist, my goal is to provide access to the historic record, but that doesn't mean I necessarily agree with any particular archival documents that I share or provide. And as the Drexel University Archives acknowledges in our statement on harmful content in archival collections, archival material can contain offensive and harmful language, but as archival practice, we don't alter or obscure that for the sake of historic documentation. To do otherwise would basically be censorship. So if Stacy, if you could share the link to the statement on harmful content and also the Drexel University Archives statement on inclusivity. And this particular webinar does include quotes from archival documents, which include outdated and offensive terminology. And to proceed, so something we take for granted now is that when we're gathering demographic information on a particular institution or a region or a social group or whatever, race is almost always included. But whatever that data is going to be used for, we understand nowadays that race is an essential piece of information for analysis. But that has not always been the case. And Drexel didn't begin systematically gathering and collating data on the race of enrolled students, alumni, faculty, or staff until the 1970s. They did request that students provide that information, for example, on this application form from circa 1900, as you can see. Apologies, as you can see here, but they weren't gathering it or collating it at that time, which sort of begs the question of why they were asking for it. So the data that they did gather and collate and make tables out of and so on and use for analysis and for long-term planning, that was mostly focused on the number of women and men enrolled in specific schools or colleges or specific courses of study. Also, students' geographic origin was kind of commonly looked at, and sometimes like right after World Wars, the number of veterans was something that they paid attention to, and occasionally religious affiliation as well. So for sorry, I'm like. Okay, I think I cut a slide where I showed a table of students enrolled in engineering courses in the up till the 1950s, which was interesting because women weren't allowed into the engineering courses till 1943. So that table would be useful for studying that sort of thing. In any event, sorry. Okay, sorry about that. So before the impact of the civil rights movement, tracking of the enrollment, retention, and graduation rates of racial minorities just wasn't seen by the administration as a factor to consider for long-term planning or attracting prospective students or whatnot. Now, since it opened in 1892, Drexel has, at least on paper, always been open to applicants regardless of gender, ethnicity, religion, or race. But in practice, it's easy to see that the student body was almost entirely white for most of Drexel's history, just from flipping through yearbooks. And it's true that you can't tell from a photo how someone actually identified, especially if it's black and white. But you can still tell, that overall the students are, for the most part, white. And the majority of the lectures have been scanned and uploaded to our digital repository. So you can, take a look at them for yourself. And if you could, Stacey, if you could drop the link to the lectures in the chat. So we can tell, from the yearbooks, if nothing else, that Black students were present, but in tiny numbers. But that doesn't mean that concrete specific demographic data isn't still valuable. And this is demonstrated by the fact that researchers interested in various topics on Drexel history ask us for that kind of information. It's not uncommon. And it's actually that getting those repeated questions and repeatedly not really being able to answer them, that's what prompted me to start gathering any demographic data that I happened to come across just in the course of looking through various materials for work. But the enrollment data I've come across is really fragmentary, like so fragmentary that I can't provide you with a bar chart or bar graph or anything like that. And it also provides, a partial picture of Drexel administration's policies and practices and the attitudes and behaviors of specific individuals, but that's still not the full story. They just provide avenues for further research. So I'm going to present some of these documents that I've come across, which are like a tiny, I haven't found a huge number of documents, but this is still like a very small number of the items that I would have liked to share. But there's only so much time, unfortunately, during this webinar. If anyone's curious, then you can certainly get in touch with us at archives.drexel.edu, and I can share other materials as well. So what I noticed is that often specific numbers would show up in administrative correspondence because someone external to Drexel wrote to the administration specifically asking about enrollment of Black students. These excerpts are from 1946. A student at Rosemont College was doing research for a paper, and she wrote to the registrar asking about Drexel's admission policy for Black students, number of enrolled Black students, and number of Black faculty. And the registrar's office didn't have this information ready to hand. So they reached out to a couple administrators, and just as to back up a bit, some relevant context is that for most Drexel's history, up until the 1990s, it had a day program and an evening program, and these were administratively pretty separate. So they asked Laura S. Campbell, who was the director of the evening school, and she said that she estimated there were 2 to 8 enrolled Black students every year. And she can recall 3 Black students who actually graduated in the past 28 years. So she was an administrator in the evening school starting in 1922. So based on her memory, that's what she remembered, which is probably undercounting, but it is certainly a pretty abysmal retention rate. Definitely well below 10% retention of Black students. And then Dean Robert Disk, he responded that they had 1 Black student enrolled in the rest of Drexel, and that was in the library school. And then in 1947, John Francis Williams, a Black lawyer in Philadelphia, wrote to Drexel President James Kreese asking about Drexel's enrollment policy. He said, he wrote, "For over 15 years, I've passed by Drexel Institute in the mornings coming to my office, which was formerly on South Broad Street. And during all that time, I get to see a Negro student among the scores that I've noticed entering your institution," end quote. Well, actually, I mean, he specifically says it's unclear to him just from looking at the students around Drexel, whether or not Drexel does admit Black students at all. President James Kreese responds that, they don't have that information ready to hand, but he estimates no more than a dozen total. And he also notes that, they ask students of color to identify them. They ask people to identify themselves based on race, but they aren't keeping track of that at all. And so jumping ahead to the 70s, at which point Drexel is gathering this kind of data. So this is student data and minority enrollments from September 1975. And so as we can see, they are gathering this data now, but using outdated and or offensive terminology. And I've pulled out in text the data for enrolled Black students specifically, and it's still 10% enrollment, under 10% enrollment across the board, undergrad, grad programs, the evening college. And then, so the Communicator was the newsletter of the Afro-American Society, which was established in early 1968, the first student group for Black students, and renamed the Black Student Union in, I think, 1984, I believe. And this issue on the back includes a list of all the Black students who graduated that year. And it might not, I think it might just be the undergrads and not any graduate students or the library school. But in any event, I counted, could be off, but I counted 92 students on this list. And so by this point, yeah, Drexel had been gathering demographic information for some years, but it's still really valuable because it gives us specific names. And this is something I stumbled across while doing an inventory project on the periodicals collection. I could not have found it like by doing a keyword search or something. And when I found it, it actually made me think of a specific researcher. We had, I think in my first or second year here, and an undergraduate student who wanted to do her final paper for a class on Black women in STEM subjects at Drexel, which is a great topic, but that it would be very time consuming to do the research on that. And she had like 3 weeks, and so I had to tell her like that wasn't going to be a feasible topic given the time that she had. And so I helped her shift her topic to something based on using the yearbooks. But this document gives us the names of several Black women who graduated from the College of Science and the College of Engineering. And so this would have been like an actually pretty good starting point, even given the amount of the small amount of time that she had. And so we've scanned and uploaded all the issues of the Communicator that we have in the periodicals collection. And this is a very large collection that is currently in the process of being re-inventoried and reorganized. And for the most part is entirely unscanned so far, but we did think that the Communicator should be a priority. So that's been uploaded. Okay, so why is it that the Drexel student body was almost entirely white for so many decades, and even as and why were there always so few Black students, even as the number of Black people in Philadelphia increased over the course of the Great Migration? And there are certainly factors outside Drexel's control. But I've also come across administrative correspondence which records policies and also the attitudes of specific Drexel administrators, which certainly would have impacted the number of Black students who applied in the first place and who actually completed a degree. So going back to 1946, so this is Laura S. Campbell, and she was an administrator in the evening program from 1922 until 1948. And to remind you, she's the one who remembers 3 graduates over the course of her career. And so how does she explain this terrible retention rate? Quote, she says, as a rule, the colored student does not seem to have staying qualities, end quote. So from her perspective, it's not Drexel's fault, and it's not Drexel's problem either. You know, it's not something that they're doing. Yeah. And then Sir Robert C. Disk, Dean of the Faculty, and he worked at Drexel for many, many decades. He started as an engineering professor, but moved into administration pretty quickly. And so he notes in his letter that, you know, they don't discriminate in admissions. And he also says, quote, we are compelled, however, to warn in advance those who wish to take cooperative courses that we cannot promise cooperative assignments, and we have therefore advised them to attend non-cooperative colleges, end quote. And I've seen this kind of unofficial policy show up in other documents, and sometimes also casting it as being reluctant to train people for professions when they're unlikely to find jobs. And so it's effectively an unofficial policy of discouraging Black applicants. And it could be seen as well-intentioned, and it could be seen other ways, such as just an unwillingness to try to change things. Or you know, given Drexel's, you know, kind of connections with industry, they could have, one can imagine things that they could have done. Or simply not thinking of this as something that needs to be changed, simply not seeing the number of Black people and other people of color in the professions as a matter of concern. But things have changed to some extent, certainly. And so how did this happen? And I've also come across documents that suggest the process. I certainly could not, you know, like write an article, you know, sketching it out. But I found documents that certainly provide threads that researchers could pull on to find out more. And some of them document ways that external individuals and institutions put pressure on Drexel, starting in the 1960s at least, in various ways, certainly as part of the civil rights movement, demanding for more equitable treatment in general. So for example, this memo, it shows the president of Drexel at the time, Haggerty, inviting 2 of the deans to a meeting with, I don't know how to pronounce her first name, but Dr. Miracle Neil Young. And this is in 1965. And the meeting is, and Dr. Young was the district superintendent in the West Philadelphia district of the school system, which was, you know, a largely Black part of Philadelphia. And the purpose of the meeting is to, quote, we shall be talking about the number of students, or lack of them, who enter Drexel from the West Philadelphia and John Bartram high schools, so, end quote. So 2 high schools that were certainly majority Black at the time. And so I don't know what came of this meeting. I don't know kind of what preceded it or followed it. I have come across, you know, kind of other correspondence that also indicates ongoing conversations, shall we say, between individuals in the public school system and Drexel. But again, I couldn't, you know, kind of provide much more than that. And there's also stuff, some things from the national level. So this is a letter signed by Martin Luther King Jr. writing on behalf of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, requesting Drexel provide scholarships for Black students, for example. And just another example I've seen is a correspondence starting in like the mid-50s, I think, with Lincoln University, is a historically Black university, to kind of do, I can't remember the word, you know, 3 years at Lincoln and then 3 years at Drexel for an engineering master's degree. And I found like a couple things. I don't know exactly, kind of where that went or what impact it had at Drexel. And then, of course, there's also a material that documents the efforts of students, faculty, and staff trying to make changes within Drexel. And just as one example, this is a part of recommendations for affirmative action, which is reprinted in the Triangle issue for June 23rd, 1972. And it's from the Afro-American Society, the student group. Just kind of one piece of the story of the efforts of students to make changes here. And this is certainly only like one little piece of that one item documenting that process in our collections, and showing how things have changed at Drexel because people outside Drexel and many people within Drexel have worked toward that for a very long time. Okay, so Stacy asked me last week, so what's the point of sharing these things? Especially, quoting white administrators being racist in the 1940s, what's the benefit? And so, like I said at the beginning, the goal of archivists is to steward and provide access to the historic record, including the parts that are upsetting. I think often, the social media, the presence of history on social media often focuses on the positives, but not the process of getting to the positives, for example. And also, I feel like I'm in part, this is a response to all the researchers we've had in the past and the ones we will have in the future, asking for complete demographics for students of color enrolled at Drexel over the course of Drexel's history, which we cannot provide, or who want to know the first Black person to graduate from the program they're in, or whatnot, And these questions can be difficult or even impossible to answer. But I really don't want to say we don't have that information unless I'm confident that we don't. And I also like to provide some explanation for why it's difficult to answer these questions. I don't want to just say no. And I'm hoping that this might spark someone to be curious about specific aspects of Drexel's history, about how Drexel administration responded to the demands of the civil rights movement as that became more and more impossible for them to ignore, and curiosity about specific Drexel students, faculty, staff, and alumni who put immense effort into forcing change to happen, and whose work may not really be remembered at this point, and not commemorated, I suppose. We're familiar with the story of the civil rights movement, in general, broadly, but kind of how did it go down at Drexel specifically? And so it would take a great deal more time than I have, unfortunately, to do the amount of research to kind of pull these fragments together and create more of a story. But I hope that someone does do that sooner or later. And I will end it on that note. And questions. Oh, and also just in general, if you have questions about archive stuff, you can get in touch with us at archives@drexel.edu. So yeah, questions.
Hey, Simon, it's Fanny.
Hey.
Hi, thank you so much for presenting today on this stuff. I know you and I worked closely when I was trying to do some research on behalf of Dubac and Angela, who's on the call here. As we were doing research for Legacy to Share book, you provided a lot of insight. I'm glad to see that you've taken a step further and really kind of dug a little deeper. It was nice to see some of the information you found, because we have some of it. It's just not a complete history, but you do get a sense of feeling from what you've uncovered. But so I just want to say thank you. And I've relied on archives. I know we've sat many hours flipping through the Tribune, you and Matthew helping me just going through all the yearbooks and stuff. But you're right, you can't, I mean, there is stuff that probably is there. It just takes a lot more intense research.
Yeah, thank you. And really, I mean, it was you asking on behalf of DUBAC that really like kind of got me to be like, okay, I should start like kind of when I find this stuff, I should start, you know, making a note of it because there's clearly a desire for this information. So thank you.
Exactly. And thank you, Fanny, for that comment. And Simon, thank you as well. I know we have a page dedicated to Drexel Black pioneers who came out of the late 60s, early 70s as a result of a lot of
Froze up a little bit.
I think she might, Angela, if you can still hear us, I think you're frozen. Table her comment for now, and then hopefully she'll come back on.
Yeah, yeah.
In lieu of any other questions coming up right now, I'll just echo the responses from Fanny and Angela to say thank you, that this was really informative and interesting. And I particularly found the correspondence from Martin Luther King to be eyebrow raising and cool that we were even on his radar. But
I mean, it was, I guess for a little more context, it was like a form letter sort of thing, you know, it was like, clearly they were sending it out to like lots of institutions, but it is actually signed by him. And I don't know, that was pretty cool, you know. there's certainly pleasant surprises in the archives as well. So
definitely.
Simon, if you could go back to the newsletter that got started where they listed the list of the graduates. Did you find more copies of those? And was that one of the links that was in the chat?
Yeah, that's the communicator. And so the issues that we have, there could be other issues elsewhere in the collections, but the issues that we have in the periodicals collection, those have all been scanned and uploaded.
Okay. No, it's funny when you put the list up, I was scanning through the list of names to see if there's anybody we actually included in our Legacy to Share book, which had 50, and we did try to span, I think it started from the 70s, authors from the 70s on. Definitely as a result of the civil rights movements, and I think those are the alumni that we managed to kind of connect with. I'm kind of bummed that Angela hasn't been able to get back on.
Yeah,
Angela, you back?
But I mean, she can, you know, she's welcome to reach out to us.
Yeah. Just so you know, in case many of you guys don't know, we did leave copies of the Legacy to Share book. It's in archives, also in the library, I believe, but she is the driving force. I mean, that was her vision for that book. And I had the pleasure of being included and working on that and really getting to know the archives office. So it's been good for me, but I know she has so much, there was so much stuff we wanted to include, but and there is talk of a second volume. So I'm not going to say anything more than that.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's Angela's going to, I don't think Angela and I spearheading that one, but certainly there is information that's still to be, like you just said, you guys are discovering, unraveled to discover. You can't deny history. And so it's a matter of how do you frame it, or how do you play it? How does that play into whatever they might do as a second edition or second volume? Yeah.
And who's going to be able to make time to do, you know, the work of digging through stuff, right?
Well, let's put it this way. After going through this first book where we all were kind of doing it as, you know, what is the saying? We're building the plane as we go, as we're flying. It's a little bit now, we know how much time it will take to do what I call the background research that we needed to do. So there were definitely pieces that we wanted to do more of. I mean, they loved all the archive information I brought back for them, but it was then figuring out how do you lay the book out. And I think they decided to focus on the five key figures that were written about, that, you know, from William Sidney Pittman to Betty Barbara John Powell. But I mean, there were certain people they decided to focus on, and not they originally was a section on what we discovered, you and I and Matthew, and it just became perhaps it's something we table, and because we needed more information from also today's data that they were collecting, and I don't think we had enough time to go to institutional research to do the comparatives or to do the trends. And that's really one of the reasons we didn't include a lot of the stuff I know they wanted to.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's not atypical with this. Like I said, with this presentation, like there's various things I really wanted to include, but like there's certainly not time for this. And the more context you need to provide and unpack for readers, the more work goes into it. So but I do hope that they're able to continue that. So because it's really valuable.
Give it till the end of the year. They have to come up with a new crew.
Yeah. Here's hoping.
Matthew, I think I saw your hand raised. Do you have a question?
Well, I just wanted to offer a comment, just kind of following up on the issue of the difficulties and challenges of doing this kind of research in the archives, which is that one of our priorities for this coming year in Drexel University Archives is to try to make that work easier, in the sense of we are initiating some efforts to go through some of our collections and try to identify materials that speak to some of the hidden histories of students of color, people of color more generally at Drexel, and other oppressed and marginalized groups within the university's history, so that people who come to us with questions on these topics in the future will have, not necessarily a full picture, but at least some more opportunities to identify useful materials and find those materials in our collections. And it's kind of challenging to figure out how to go about doing this kind of descriptive work and in some cases indexing work in a way that's going to be manageable, because it's potentially a overwhelming task. But that's something we're really as I said, it's a priority for us, and we've taken some initial steps, and it's really building on the kind of initial steps that Simon outlined in his presentation. And I don't know if you want to add anything to what I just said, Simon.
We're a tiny department. This sort of work is essential and also time consuming if you're going to do it properly. So, like we're starting with a student worker position, it's kind of like as the first stage of this particular project, for example, because like there's 3 full-time staff and there's a lot of things to get done. So, and if there are any, current students listening or watching this later, we do hire student workers, and we do have host co-op student positions. So FYI, keep that in mind. And you don't have to be a history major either. Just curious about history. That's and detail oriented. But but the point is, there's just limits on how much we can get done. Even for things that we consider to be really important. So.
I did have a question. Have you seen any interest from folks? You mentioned that one student who was doing her project. Have you seen has anybody raised their hand about interest in this particular topic recently, or besides?
It's not on, you mean specifically Black women in STEM or more broadly? Like
just this particular topic, if they were doing a study on just demographics and such like that. It really is not an uncommon question for Drexel staff, doing PR stuff, or students doing research or whatnot, to want to know the first person to do something, or the specific numbers for a certain year. Actually, the fact that Drexel has, at least on paper, not discriminated based on race means that like an institution where that was the case, and then they did start allowing people of color
into a program or women into a program, there's always going to be like a lot of documentation because it would have been controversial, you know, and because so then at least you know kind of who the first people are. You have their names, right? And a lot of opinions about them. But because Drexel has always, at least on paper, not discriminated, that makes it harder to identify the first people of color, the first women, whatnot. And we do get questions like that, you know. So it's, I guess I haven't been trying to figure out the proportion of inquiries we get, on that topic, but it's, it's happened enough, it's frequent enough that by the time that you were asking on behalf of VBAC, it was like, okay, like I might as well kind of start keeping an eye out for this and noting it down whenever I do come across it. So yeah. And Angela's back, so I don't know if she wants to.
Yes. So again, thank you very much. You contributed to the notables in our book. One of the questions that I had is around connecting the dots in terms of identifying those alumni today and being able to develop a database of alums. Do you have any suggestions on how we could begin to do that?
I could certainly come up with some. I guess it's a question of how long I would talk about it. I mean, actually, that would be an interesting conversation to have, but like it's not like a one-sided like short answer, I guess.
Yeah.
And I genuinely like we really would like to talk about ways to collaborate, since I'm sure that you are aware of alums that we would like to have on our radar who we don't currently, who we might have material about, but we could not help guide researchers to at this point, for example. Like it's not uncommon for us to learn things about Drexel history that or specific individuals in Drexel history from people who come to us asking questions about them. So I guess the short answer is steps to that would be having a conversation about how that could happen, but just talking more about kind of work we're doing and also learning more about what Black alumni are interested in, what they need and want, because certainly we respond to what we know
Okay.
teachers want.
Well, I look forward to the collaboration.
Yeah.
And it's the alumni office, so I will be working with that too.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I have access to the database.
Okay.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much. Are there any other questions as we finish up today? I'm not seeing any raised hands or anything in the chat, so I'm going to go ahead and end us here. Again, thank you so much, everybody that attended. Thank you, Simon. And this recording, I will be sending out the recording for the session later today or tomorrow. Again, appreciate you all being here. So thank you so much and have a great day.